I'm Michael Harrison. Welcome to Up Close, Far Out, a video podcast series here on the Talkers Media YouTube channel for communications professionals, pop culture aficionados, political junkies, media freaks, science enthusiasts, fans of radio, followers of technology, and the philosophically curious. My guest today is an esteemed radio broadcaster, a nationally acclaimed talk show host who got his start in radio at age 16, spinning records and reading news, sports, and weather at the edge of a cow pasture in Tillamook, Oregon, on the mighty 1590 KTIL. Now, 49 years later, on the verge of a half century in the broadcasting business, he's only moved 75 miles east of Portland, but light years to the right. He's an ardent conservative, but he's open on his show to taking calls from people who disagree with him. Now, this Emmy and Peabody Award winner delivers 6 hours of radio backed by 4 decades of experience as a radio and television journalist each and every day. 6 hours of daily prep keep his program on top of the news cycle and top of mind for listeners across the country. He's one of the hardest working people in the radio business. Now, along the way, he's worked for more than a dozen radio stations and 5 television stations. Today, he hosts 2 syndicated radio shows, one for the Pacific Northwest states of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho on the Radio Northwest Network. His national show is carried by more than 100 stations from Maine to Honolulu, from Anchorage to Corpus Christi. Both are carried afternoons on his flagship station, KXL, a heritage radio outlet in Portland. Along the way, our guest has picked up more than 70 awards from the Associated Press, the Society of Professional Journalists, the National Press Club, including 2 Emmys and a Peabody for his reporting and documentaries. Our guest this week is Lars Larson. Here we go. Lars Larson, can you believe that when you and I did that trip across Israel, I have it in my den, a big picture of talkers of you and I with our colleagues in Zippy Livni's office in Tel Aviv. That was, I looked at the date, 2007.
Unbelievable.
I mean, wow. I bet with all the stuff going on in the Middle East, several trips that you made back in that era in Israel come right back to the forefront of your mind.
They absolutely do, because you get such a different perspective by being on the ground, meeting young IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, many of them Americans who made Aliyah, moved up by emigrating to Israel, and then have to do their years of service for the IDF, and getting their perspective on things. It changes what you hear. And let me give you one small example. There was a young man on one of the trips. I don't believe it was the trip you and I took, but perhaps the one where my wife and I shepherded a group of 90, 2 of whom had been to Israel before, the other 88 had not. I had been there. Tina had never been there. And this young man was telling me, he said, we were talking about the Palestinians, so-called, and he said, well, a lot of times you don't even know who the Palestinians are. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, one morning I was scheduled to get my hair cut from the guy who usually cut my hair. And I showed up and he didn't show up. And I talked to him on the phone later and I said, what happened? He said, oh, I got stuck at a checkpoint. And only then did he realize that the young man who'd been regularly cutting his hair was a Palestinian, and that he had to come from his home. And I'm not exactly, I think his home was on the west bank of the Jordan River, that he had to come through a number of checkpoints. Checkpoints had tightened up because of terrorism, and the young man wasn't able to make it to work. But until then, this IDF soldier didn't know that the guy cutting his hair with a sharp pair of scissors was in fact a Palestinian.
That's a fascinating insight. And isn't it interesting how in places that are supposedly war-torn and under strife, and the people are at each other's throats and not getting along, that if you actually, inject yourself into the culture on the street, that the people actually do get along, and that most of the strife is hyped up by the politicians, the extremists, and the media.
Yeah, exactly so. And in fact, I've had people say, well, if only they'd let those Palestinian people be part of their culture. And I said, well, on one of the trips, we went to the Gaza Strip, which I always repeat, it's about 5 miles wide and 25 miles long. It's a tiny slice of land. And I was told that, well, the young men and women from Gaza used to be able to go to the community college in Israel. And I said, well, how did they get there? He said, they'd go to a gate, they'd go through the gate, they'd go to school all day and then come home or back to their job. and they got a chance to be educated. But then when Hamas decides to fire some rockets, set off some bombs, send in somebody with knives to stab innocent people at a bus stop, all of a sudden, as you can imagine, security tightens up and the kids can't go to college. And so people should realize that when Hamas, the official government of Gaza, chosen by the voters of Gaza, chooses to take these kinds of actions, and it's all under their control. It would be like being in Capone, Chicago. Nothing happens in Gaza without Hamas saying so, that they are cutting off those very opportunities, and they are doing it, I think, for a couple of reasons. One, Hamas is a terrorist group. They're going to do acts of terrorism. But number two, the minute you see people in Gaza and people in Israel proper being able to be co-educated, work alongside one another, when that happens, Hamas is over, because the people will say, we don't want trouble. We want to be able to get along with these people. We may not agree
Good
with them,
point.
but, and at that point, Hamas is done.
Very good point. I talk to people around the world. I have friends and family in different countries, some of whom have not been here or ever been here in the United States. And they say, it must be tough being there with everybody fighting and everybody hating each other, and it's on the brink of civil war. And the same thing is true here in the United States, isn't it? You really, the place to really see the violence and the hatred between the peoples of our country is on the news, because you don't really see it in real life. What a
Michael,
disconnect.
you made the point that I've been doing the show now since March of 2020. And when I moved home, I don't know, a year and a half later, the station called me and said, hey, you've been doing the show at home for a couple of years now. Are you okay with that? And I said, yeah. Are you okay with that? And they said, yeah. But before I did that, Michael, the images most frequently seen during the riots of the summer of 2020 were in Portland, Oregon, but they were in fact about a block and a half, not a New York City block, the shorty blocks they have in Portlandia. And it was a block and a half from the studio. I could look out my window and see where those images that you saw of fireworks being fired and non-lethal projectiles being fired back, and a courthouse that was being set on fire, and a big police building was being set on fire. All of that was happening a block and a half away. And yet that was a couple of thousand people at most in a city of almost 700,000, in a metro area of about 2 million. And you say, well, hold on. So there's a lot of trouble there. I said, yeah, for a very small number of people in a very constrained area. But much like I've never been to Lebanon. Actually, this arm has been to Lebanon, because one time we were at the gate and I stuck my arm in there and I said, my arm is in Lebanon. But having read about it, there are a couple of areas of Lebanon that are completely, bombed out kind of places. And you go 2 streets over and it's nightclubs and restaurants and stores, never having seen it myself, but see plenty of stories where you say, if you see the trouble's happening in one little area, and everything around it is just life going on as usual.
Well, that's what's so amazing about television. And you have a background in TV. You have a very strong background in TV. As a matter of
Face
fact,
for radio, but yes, I do have to
you have a
admit,
face for
I have to
television
plead
too.
guilty to TV for about 20 years.
And we recently had Joe Pagliarulo, and he's
Great
also
man.
a former TV guy. And I was telling Matthew, the producer of our show, and my son, that it's going to be good to have Lars on, because guys that know how to do TV, who are now in radio, are great at this video hybrid, that you don't freak out. Like, I actually do feel, sitting here and the way the camera is lined up, you and I are across the country from each other, but I actually can feel that we're looking directly into each other's eyes. Now, are you getting that from your end? Because you're looking directly into my eyes.
Here's the thing. Television is fun, but my first love was radio. But I have to tell you something, Michael, one of the dirty little secrets, and you see it come to fore, especially during times like this, is that people who have a radio background who go into TV, they know how to address a camera or address a microphone. They know how to ad lib. They can actually talk on their feet. There are an awful lot of television people who can't work without a script, without a teleprompter. And it's sad, because they did a couple of years in radio. They'd either learn how to do it or they'd be in trouble.
what an eye opener for them when they get the gig in radio and they have to be on for 3 hours and it's spontaneous and you're always doing that dance on the edge that one wrong word and you're fired, or missing an opportunity, you look like a wimp. It's like Mission Impossible. And then if you get caught, the secretary disavows any knowledge of your mission whatsoever. And and the people that hired you to be outrageous claim that they're victimized by your outrageousness. It's a people don't realize what a tough game this is. One more thought about the TV thing.
Yeah.
Television, and again, your background in TV I think you'll see what I'm saying, and we've talked about it. It frames things in a way that even though it's amazingly accurate in some ways, like watching a World Series and seeing the nose hairs coming out of the catcher's face. I mean, it's like, wow, look at the TV coverage. It also gives a very warped impression. And when I first became aware of that was during America Held Hostage, Day 81. This is Ted Koppel in front of the American Embassy in Tehran. And you see thousands of angry people. And, and it was actually a soundstage.
Yeah.
Because if you told the camera back, the city was just going on its business. And there was like little World Crisis Day at Disney World happening in the middle of the city in front of the American Embassy. And that was when it first occurred to me just how framing can really give a distorted image of world events.
Well, and in fact, it's the job of reporters, which they aren't doing a very good job of right now. But it's the job of reporters to set it in proper context. And I recall within the last couple of months, there was an event. Kamala Harris had an event. It looked like she had this big crowd of people behind her because of the way TV had framed it. And a few critics had taken pictures from the back of this hall. And what it showed was Kamala Harris at a podium, and behind her a riser that had a relatively small number of people, but they were all bunched up behind her in the camera view, and the rest of the room was empty. And you say, okay, it's all right for somebody like George Lucas to create a crowd scene in which there are only a few real people there, but it looks like a crowd because you use CG or use different camera angles. But when television news does it and they convey an impression that this must be a huge number of people in this community who are upset about something or celebrating something, whichever the case may be, they're being dishonest if they don't show you, no, this is actually a very small event with a small number of people who've been carefully staged to present an image. Well, it may be the job of the campaign, whichever campaign it is, to stage an image. They didn't have to do that at Madison Square Garden, by the way, for Donald Trump's rally. But when they do it, it's the job of the TV reporter to say there were really only 150 people there. But from the pictures, it might look like there were more. There weren't. And it is your job to do that.
Of course, with the advent of AI and the infiltration of, shall we say, more respectable parts of the media in seeking clicks and eyeballs and eardrums and numbers and likes, used to be just podcasters did that and people with YouTube shows, but now everybody all the way up to the top networks are obsessed with creating drama, soap operatic drama, to get people to tune in. It's such a hustle for ratings and then of course revenue. And then, as I said, with AI, are you concerned that there'll be nobody to trust anymore anywhere about these things?
It will be very difficult, Michael, because I think we've only seen the front edge of AI. And if you remind yourself of what the world was like before, say, cell phones, I'm old enough, you're old enough to remember the world without cell phones. It's a game changer. And then you have the internet that comes along, and that changes things. That when AI comes along and comes into its full flavor, you're going to see things done with AI. And probably the things that will be the most disturbing are not the ones where there's just an overt fake. Donald Trump riding on the back of a horse shirtless next to Vladimir Putin. Okay, we know that's a fake. What about the ones where there's a more subtle use of AI and you don't realize it? And I know all these efforts of government to try to control the use of AI. I don't think that's going to work any more than government could have regulated the use of CG by Hollywood to say, no, that guy really didn't jump from one building to another or flip that car. It was created in a computer. And when you see that applied to politics, Michael, whichever side of the aisle you're from, that's going to be disturbing because it's going to create an impression for people that just isn't real.
Real and it could happen with either side or any side. And we're at a time right now where the media is so polarized in the daily dance of affirmation. You know, I try to remain apolitical, and I guess I've done a good job of holding down a platform like Talkers Magazine and
Yep.
Talkers in the middle of one of the most increasingly polarized, increasingly controversial areas of the media. You know, talk radio, talk media that there is. So I guess there's a
You get
place.
along with everyone, with the Tom Hartmans of the world, who I've met Tom. Tom used to live in the same town as me. He's been to my house. I've been to his house, and we get along well. We disagree about things, but that's okay. That's America, right?
Well, my belief, but the reason I'm able to do it is because I don't believe either side is as terrible as the other side says it is. I mean, you know, anybody who now disagrees with any policy is a devil. I mean, doesn't that disturb you a little bit?
It does. And in fact, as you and I are talking, there's the rollout from the Madison Square Garden rally by Donald Trump. And what's the left media doing? MSNBC, which is just shameful in the way that they handle things, are running clips from a Nazi rally that happened at Madison Square Garden in the 30s. Now, what they're not running are the anti-Nazi rally in 1942, nor the images from Jimmy Carter's nomination at Madison Square Garden in the 1970s, nor the nomination of that horny hick from Arkansas, Billy Clinton, who was nominated there in the early 1990s. They're saying Donald Trump had an event at a well-known, famous New York City venue, and it must be evil because almost 100 years ago there was a rally there that, but today you look back and think, okay, I can't believe there was a pro-Nazi rally at MSG, but they choose that one thing and say that defines the venue. I don't think so.
Okay, but I know that you're just bursting at the seams to want to get into a political discussion
No,
with me.
I won't drag you there, Michael.
But I have to ask you this
Yeah.
first of all, just to set the context, because this particular conversation, all things being equal, will exist thousands of years into the future. So, and we're caught up in the moment that today is Monday and yesterday was the Sunday of the MSG rally.
Yep.
So it's fresh in our minds. Was there anything about that rally that you said to yourself, ooh, that doesn't make us look good?
Yeah, they hired a comic. I'd never heard of the guy before, and he told a bunch of jokes. Now, I expect every comic, except maybe Sinbad, to tell off-color jokes. He told some that were way over the top, way beyond what was reasonable, and everybody said, well, who invited him? Well, somebody on the Trump team invited him. And Michael, in some ways, I feel for the Trump campaign. I'm a Trump partisan. Unlike you, I take a position, and that's okay. But I respect your neutral position. But what do you do when the media and the left in America have made Donald Trump so toxic that if you were to approach, say, a comic who is a conservative, but maybe he's privately conservative, and say, you want to come and do an event, and you say, no, I don't want that connection, because if I do that if I have that connection made, it may total my career. It may damage me, at least very seriously. And so maybe that's why they ended up with that comic. But he told some, he said some terrible things about Puerto Rico that I don't agree with, and Donald Trump doesn't agree with. So do we define the entire event? How about we define an event that drew 20,000 inside MSG, a capacity crowd, at least that number, and maybe as many as 75,000 outside, and had a huge contingent of Jews for Trump who are holding up a flag of Israel, and conservatives are now joking, hey, is that a Nazi flag, since we're being told this is a Nazi event? She stood up and sang the national anthem, and sang it beautifully, I might mention, but she's a Black American. And you say, is she at a Nazi rally? But of course, MSNBC. See, and this is where reporters really could do themselves a favor by saying, yes, there was an event there in the 30s. And there were the other events that have happened there that defined the venue differently. And there was, of course, a large contingent of Jewish people who believe that Donald Trump's the right choice. And there was a Black lady singing the national anthem. So isn't it the best thing about journalism when you can say, hear both sides of it. Now you, the audience, decide. And it's really kind of arrogant. I've always thought it was arrogant when reporters decide, I know the proper point of view about this, and I'm going to frame my whole story so you get to the point of view that I want you to get to. That is not a journalist's job. Maybe a pundit's job, but it's not a journalist's job.
You see, I see it slightly differently. I see it even worse. I see it that the journalists today are, I call it the daily dance of affirmation, that the media outlets today are serving up the slop that they think their target audiences want.
I
That,
guess. But
that
Michael, and I will tell you one thing about the show. I mean, I've now been doing talk radio full time since 97, national since '03. And one of the first things I did, and my producer, who by the way went to work for Tom Hartman, and God bless her, she was a great producer, but she decided she wanted to work elsewhere, and that's fine. Not because of my politics, I think she just wanted a change in her life. But I told her we're going to create something that I haven't heard on other shows, and we're going to call it Naysayers Go First. And she said, "What do you mean by that?" I said, "Well, at some shows, if you call in and you say, Rush Limbaugh is full of baloney, when the late great Rush was still around, you say, well, no, we don't want you on because you disagree with the host." I wanted people, and I still do. And I get naysayers on almost a daily basis calling in saying, "You're wrong about this." I say, "Great, make your argument, and then let me ask some questions." I trust my audience to be able to hear both sides, and then they can make up their own mind. My audience is smart enough to make up its own mind, having heard how I got to a position and how a naysayer got to his position and how the naysayer answers my questions and how I answer the naysayer's questions. And they're Americans. They can decide on their own which side do you believe, or are you somewhere in the middle?
in today's highly competitive, democratized media, wouldn't you say to a certain degree we get the audiences we deserve, or nicely put, we get the audiences we nurture? That
Yeah.
that in fact, if you have an audience that you think is smart enough to understand that you are going through an exercise of information by having somebody on that they probably don't agree with and that you don't agree with, and you do the naysayer thing, that you're not a rhino and that you're not selling out and that you're not taking that side, whereas other audiences, they'll come down on you for even having the person on the platform at all. So it goes back to even before when we were talking about governments and people getting along, the old saying, you get the government you deserve, which is a tricky little thing there because some people just haven't got the ability to resist certain movements in history that take over power. Power is a hard thing to get out from under when the wrong people get it. But what do you think about the whole daily dance of affirmation in the media and taking it all the way up to the question, do we get the government we deserve?
Yeah, we do to some extent. I mean, and the government that perhaps we've been engineered to vote for, because if the mainstream media, even Fox, had its way, Kamala Harris would be the next president. And as I said, I don't believe as a journalist, I was a straight ahead, no opinions journalist for 20 years. I kept my opinion out. In fact, I was made managing editor of the Fox affiliate in Portland. And they told me, you are editing, you're looking at the scripts that the reporters turn in, and you change that, you do what you need to do. And I would call a reporter over and say, "What's this?" They said, "Well, and they had written an opinion line in. I said, "Who said that?" And they said, "Well, everybody knows that." And I said, "No, that's not good enough. If there's an opinion in there, it needs to come from a person and not you. You are the reporter. You are not allowed to put your opinion in the story." Now, if you have a person you've interviewed and you say, "Governor so-and-so says this is true, but Senator so-and-so says the governor is completely full of baloney," you can put both of those in. What you can't do is put your own opinion in. And to your point, Michael, some of my proudest moments are when people call the show, and I love it because it'll be a young lady or a man, and he or she will say, "I disagree with everything you stand for and everything you say on the show, but I wanted to talk to you about this." And you think, now that's somebody who's looked past that and said they completely disagree with me, but they see my program, the way I've framed it, as a great place to give voice to their point of view, which they know conflicts with mine. I think that's great.
So you still work day and night. You're doing two shows.
Yep.
You do a regional show in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho,
Yep.
and you do a national show on the Compass Network across the country that has been growing and growing and growing and growing steadily every year for years now. It seems for forever. And your home base is the great KXL in Portland, which is sort of your flagship station for all operations. Have I got it right?
Yep, you do. The heart of darkness. So I originate out of Portlandia. We call it that because the place is just it's every single stereotype you've ever heard about a liberal city and then some. And it meets all of those. I mean, the slogan they stole from Austin, Texas was keep Portland weird. It is a weird place with weird politics. And in the state of Oregon, every single statewide office is filled with a left-wing Democrat. I mean, far to the left Democrat. The majorities in both the House and the Senate of the legislature are far left wing. In Portland itself, the entire city council is made up of liberals. The entire county commission is made up of liberals. And so the place is run as a single party rule. New York State suffers from some of the same problem. And the problem is in single party rule, there's no check that pulls people back from crazy positions. There's nobody who can stand up and say, Governor, I don't think that's a good way to go about solving this problem, because they don't have to listen to the other side. The other side is such a tiny piece of influence on their positions that they go crazy. And I really do think there's kind of a yin and yang kind of arrangement that if you have a healthy amount of dissent, but you're not going to find that from the Democrat Party. They're going to simply say, and you probably wouldn't if you had a single party rule where it was overwhelmingly all Republican. There's got to be a check in there somewhere to pull you back from the brink. But the beauty of it is I've found we have the number one show, have for more than a decade in Portland. And people say, well, how do you get an audience when the Multnomah County, which is the county that Portland sits in, is party registration is 86% Democrat. And I would say that the 10 or 12% who are Republicans are probably at the Liz Cheney end of the Republican spectrum. And so you say, how do you find an audience there? And I said, because if you have any group of people anywhere in America, no matter how liberal or conservative the town is, there are going to be some from the other side. And what do they do when they turn on the radio and all they hear is liberal stuff, and turn on the TV and get the same, open up the newspaper, get the same? Every website that's based in the Pacific Northwest or Oregon or Washington is to the left. Then I'm the cool drink of water in the middle of a desert.
Yeah, and the way radio ratings are, you don't really have to have. You're not running for dog catcher or mayor. You're running for number one in a time slot
Yeah.
on a different playing board. People always used to ask me, how is Michael Savage the number one talk show host in San Francisco when he's so far to the right and it's such a liberal city? And I say he's not running for mayor. He couldn't get elected dog catcher in San Francisco, but you can, because you're providing a disgruntled population that feels that they're alienated and disenfranchised by their neighbors and by the structure of the city and the region. They find it galvanizes them. So sometimes you can get better ratings in radio going against the grain of your community than being one of all the many media that follow that particular line.
But I'm not conservative knee jerk. In other words, I try to be reasonable and say, to tell my audience, this is why this is wrong or right. And here's how I got to that. And I explain, these are the things that fed into why I've taken this position. And sometimes I disappoint conservatives by saying, well, there is a role for government in this particular case, and that nobody but government can do it. Usually it goes the other direction, because we have way too much government right now at the federal, state, and local level. But I'm willing to admit that there are times where you say this problem is one that can only be addressed by the government. And so if I do that and I explain how I got there, then the audience says, okay, I don't really like the conclusion he drew, but he makes a good argument. And then that causes them perhaps to consider or reconsider their own position.
Does it bother you when you talk about government and how government works? And this goes on with both sides. And I don't want to insinuate that I have no opinions because I'm neutral or, don't get involved. I have opinions. They're just not extreme. My main thing is I don't think either side is as terrible. I do not believe that Kamala Harris is a Marxist, and I do not believe that Donald Trump is a Nazi. Do you believe that she's a Marxist, or do you believe that we are engaging in hyperbole all the way across the
There
board?
may be a little hyperbole, but here's how I would get to that position. Number one, she grew up as the daughter of a Marxist economics
I gave you
professor
the open.
at Stanford. That's one. Her mom was far to the left as
Mm,
well, cancer researcher, but apparently had far left-wing positions. And then what does she propose for the country? She proposes an electric vehicle mandate. Now, you say, well, why is that Marxist? Because the government is deciding for the people. You will buy this automobile, whether you want to or not, whether it makes sense or not, you will. What about healthcare? Well, she's for national healthcare. That's an element of working us toward a socialist society. And she apparently believes that the government has a much bigger role than it already plays in our lives to play. And you
mm,
say, well, hold on, why don't we have a country with maximum individual liberty and the government serves the people rather than the people serving the government? And she apparently believes that she can come in and tell a company or an industry, you will do things that way. Michael, all of those are hallmarks of a socialist society where the government doesn't own the means of production, but it dictates what the means of production,
mm,
what those companies will produce. And she also has a view about individual liberty that I find deeply disturbing. One of my favorite sound bites we've been running from her lately was when she was DA of San Francisco, and they were talking about gun issues, and they were at a public event, and she said, just because you legally and law, and she said it, I can remember it almost verbatim, just because you legally and lawfully own a gun does not mean we cannot come into your home and check to make sure that you're handling that responsibly. And I thought, wow, she just threw out the Fourth Amendment altogether. You mean the government can come into the home of a legal, law abiding citizen and make sure that they're doing things right? How about this? When the government can make a case that I'm breaking the law, they are free to get a warrant from a judge and come to my house and arrest me if I've broken the law. She apparently believes the government has far more rights than that. Now, if I say, does that sound like a Marxist or a socialist? Yeah, it does.
mm. And that's the argument that the people have about the 1930s MSG event, that there are certain smells to it that are
Well,
similar to,
can I point
and
one
again,
thing?
I will not be drawn into a debate with you
No, I know you won't.
because
But Michael,
I think both sides stink. That's
it
just, that's
I
my
think there
saving.
there are odious things and odorous things on both sides. But having said that, don't forget what the Nazi Party was. It was the National Socialist
That's right.
Party, and the government ran things. And you could say, well, but Germany went from the economic doldrums. They were they were running their industries to beat the band, to try to take over the world and kill a lot of people and murder a lot of people, but they were running an economy. Well, but they were a socialist economy where the government dictated this is what we'll do. And so when I find it kind of crazy that they accuse a man, Donald Trump, of being a Nazi or having Nazi tendencies and anti Semitic tendencies. This is a man with a Jewish daughter, a Jewish son in law, and Jewish grandchildren. And you're telling me he's the anti Semite?
Those
Well,
poor children, they have a Nazi for a grandfather. I mean, I'm kidding. I'm just, all I'm saying is there's no end to it. But of course you make good cases, and it would be fun to spar with you, and I would spar either side, because I believe in the First Amendment, even though I'm starting to think that the loss of our privacy is even more of a threat to our democracy than the loss of the First Amendment. I mean, I built my whole career on making the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States my main political platform. And now I'm starting to wonder, how do we deal with the First Amendment going into this crazy new wiring of our brains and the information and the AI and everything that you and I have talked about, and make it actually be valuable? But I'm even more concerned about the loss of privacy. I think that
I am.
I think that is so overwhelmingly influential on freedom and peace of mind.
Nobody's putting a chip in my head. And I may like that Elon Musk is supporting Donald Trump. I don't like some of his more extreme ideas about chipping people, and so I'm not a fan of that, and I will resist it all the way. I want individual citizens to have the greatest individual liberty, and when they break the laws made by our representatives, then we can see some punishment for that. But don't chip the people. And no, no picture ID for voting is great. Like we have picture ID to get on an airplane, unless you're an illegal alien, in which case you're allowed to get on the airplane.
Then they move you right to first class, right? Exactly.
But yeah, it's just, oh, hey, you're a super citizen, and Americans are actually second class citizens. But I don't see the need for the government to intrude further into people's private lives unless they commit crimes. And if those are crimes, they should be crimes because our representatives representing us wrote the law and said that's illegal. Now that has been done less and less lately, and we've had more of nameless, faceless bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. at various federal agencies writing rules that have the force of law, but they're written by people who are unaccountable, unelected, and I want them. If the Congress wants to write a law, go ahead and do it. The reason they're having the agencies do it is because on both sides, members of Congress say, we don't want to get involved in voting for that. Why? We'd lose our jobs if we voted for that. So we'll let a bunch of bureaucrats do it instead. That is, in fact, the deep state that Donald Trump has talked about, of course.
And there you have it, a conversation with nationally syndicated radio talk show host Lars Larson. Lars is one of the hardest working figures in today's talk media. He's heard noon to 4 p.m. on his longtime flagship station, KXL in Portland, Oregon. He's also heard in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho on the Radio Northwest Network and on a ton of stations across America on the Compass Media Network. He's ranked at a lofty number 14 on the prestigious Talkers Heavy 100 of the 100 most important radio talk show hosts in America. For more information, please visit his website at larslarson.com. Up Close Far Out is a production of Good Phone Communications in association with Talkers. Please subscribe to the Talkers Media YouTube channel and give this episode a like. Our producer is Matthew B. Harrison. Copyright 2024. All rights reserved.